Hello, I'm Jim Leslie, a Blue Badge tourist guide, and 2022 is the year of stories. My story today is about the foundation of the College of Surgeons here in Edinburgh in 1505. Now, at the start of the 16th century, there was a real need for medical improvements. Edinburgh was a walled city. You had 50,000 people living in an area 1 mile by half a mile wide. It was dirty, it was smelly, and disease was rife. Luckily, we had a very supportive king. King James IV was described as a keen amateur dentist and surgeon. Think about that for a minute. An amateur dentist and surgeon. Who on earth did he operate on? Nevertheless, in a drive to improve standards, James IV introduced the incorporation of barber surgeons. These men, they could cut your hair, they could cut off your arm. They were multi-skilled. Very strict qualifying criteria. 1, you had to be literate. 2, you had to have a basic understanding of anatomy. Now, in 1505, our knowledge of anatomy was still pretty much based on the ancient Greeks. The ancient Greeks believed that the body had 4 humours: blood, yellow bile, black bile, and phlegm. And as long as these 4 were kept in balance, you were healthy. If they got out of balance, you were unhealthy. And that's why we used things such as bloodletting. In 1583, Edinburgh was established as the first secular university, and in the 19th century its medical school was built. And the medical school gives a pretty significant nod to the early days of the barber surgeons in these wonderful lampposts which depict leeches, cutting edge surgery in 1505. This stone commemorates James Borthwick, the first professor of anatomy for the incorporation of surgeon barbers. He used to carry out public dissections on his dining room table. He was largely responsible for the founding of the Surgeons' Hall. The problem was there was a real shortage of bodies. To maintain standards, King James decreed that the incorporation would be given the body of 1 executed murderer a year. Now that's not 1 each, that's 1 for all of them. Clearly there was a problem here. In 1751, the Murder Act was passed, stating that murderers, instead of being hung in chains or buried, would be passed to the surgeons for operations. Still not enough doctors, still not enough bodies for the surgeons to practice on. One surgeon, Archibald Pitcairn, he offered to treat paupers for free in return for unclaimed bodies being made available to him. As surgeons were paid by people watching their operations, there was a real demand for bodies, and an underground market grew up whereby the surgeons would buy a body for £8. £8 was a year's salary, quite clearly a temptation. Interestingly, bodies were not property. They didn't belong to anybody. It wasn't a crime to steal a body. It was a crime to steal their clothes or any jewellery. So you had grave robbers, body snatchers, who would dig up bodies of recently deceased people, strip them of their clothes, strip them of jewellery, and then cart the bodies to the surgeons and get their £8 in return. This meant that, obviously, very distressing for the relatives, you started to get night watchmen appointed in cemeteries to watch over the graves of the recently departed. Cemeteries had walls built around them, and watchtowers as a barrier. And if we go round the corner, I'll show you one of the other mechanisms that were put in place to look after your next of kin. I've taken you round to what is known as a Mortsafe, a safe for the dead. People who could afford it would pay for this safe to be implemented above their relatives' bodies to keep them safe for a few days. Obviously, after a few days, the body had decayed and it was no longer of any interest to the body snatchers. Of course, Edinburgh being Edinburgh, there's always a pioneer, somebody who wants to do things differently. And in Edinburgh, two men decided to cut out the middleman. Let's not wait for the bodies to be buried and dig them up. Let's just murder people and sell them to the doctors. Edinburgh's two famous murderers were Burke and Hare. And there's another video blog by my colleague Alistair Northrop, available on the Scottish Tourist Guide website. Well worth watching if you want to hear more about these two gentlemen. We're now outside the surgeon's hall. So James IV had granted the barber surgeons exclusive rights of surgery. However, by the end of the 16th century, the distinction between barbers just cutting hair and shaving and surgeons doing the more skilled job of bloodletting and amputations had become a separation. Now, amputations, very, very common in Edinburgh. If you had a broken bone and your flesh was pierced, doctors knew that you were going to get gangrene. Didn't necessarily know what gangrene was, what caused it, but they knew it would kill you. The way to avoid this was, if you got a broken bone, then they would amputate your limb. This is the days before anaesthetic. So you're operating on a wide awake patient. Speed was of the essence. If you were not fast, then two things would happen. Either the patient would die of shock, or, as happened on more than one occasion, he would jump off the table and run away, sometimes being found hiding in a nearby cupboard. The best surgeon, or the fastest surgeon, was a man was called Robert Liston. He was the fastest knife in Edinburgh. He made his own cutting tools, and he was a flamboyant man. He would walk into the operating theatre. The patient would be in front of him, and a lot of students and perhaps VIP guests would be crowded round watching him. Robert Liston would take the cigarette out of his mouth and flick it to the side. Gentlemen, start your watches. And his knife would flash and his saw would cut. And 2.5 minutes later, he would hold up the limb. Stop your clocks. And it'd be a big round of applause. 2.5 minutes to remove a limb. However, fast is not necessarily good. On one occasion, Robert Liston, just a little bit over-enthusiastic, removing a leg, cut a bit high up, removed the patient's testicles. Not good. On another occasion, he had a 300% death rate from one operation. How do you get that? Well, as per usual, he comes in, cigarette flicked to the side, the saw's being wielded, the knife blade is flashing, everybody's watching, there are oohs, there are ahs. At the end of it, Liston holds up the limb, stop your watches, and he waits for the round of applause. Silence. What has happened? Well, he looks round. There, at his feet, was one of the VIP spectators. He'd been standing a bit too close. As Liston's blade had waved, he'd sliced through the buttons of his coat, causing him to die of a heart attack. His assistant had been a little bit slow at removing his fingers. He had lost 2 of his fingers. He died of sepsis. And of course, the patient. He died of shock. 300% death rate, and this was the go-to man in Edinburgh. Medicine continued to be controversial right into the 19th century. In the second half of the 19th century, no women were admitted to study medicine anywhere in the United Kingdom. One woman, Sophia Jex Blake, decided she wanted to change that, and she applied to study medicine in Edinburgh. After much discussion, it was agreed that she could study, provided that it was restricted to the areas of obstetrics and gynecology. There were a lot of people felt that this was a bad idea. A female student would distract the men, and also there were concerns about their poor intellectual capacity and physical stamina. Some people even thought that the poor women's brains would overheat and explode. Well, having been accepted, 200 students signed a petition against it, and the university then backtracked, saying, we would have to put special circumstances, special conditions in place for you to make sure you didn't distract the men. Not worth doing that for just one student. Well, a local Edinburgh newspaper, the Scotsman, thought this was disgraceful. So they advertised for more women to come and study. The result was that 7 women enrolled in the medical class. University forced to accept them. However, lecturers were not obliged to teach them. They had to fund their own study. Their exams were different to the men's. They were graded differently. The male students treated them abysmally. When it came to exam time, they turned up at the building behind me to find the gates were locked against them. They had to stand whilst a mob of 200 students were throwing dirt and dung at them. A supporter let them into the exam hall. During the exam, sheep were released into the exam hall to disrupt it. Nevertheless, they completed their exams. The university then refused to allow them to graduate. Most of them went on to study elsewhere in Europe and got their degrees. Sophia Jakes Blake actually returned to Edinburgh and set up a medical practice. It was only very, very recently that Edinburgh University reluctantly and eventually decided to honour these 7 women and granted them posthumous degrees. I should, of course, point out that none of the brains of the 7 women exploded.